Welcome and thanks for joining us for National Citizens Inquiry Live. This is Thursday, March the 26th, 2026. I have two guests this evening to join me in this conversation. They are both individuals that served as commissioners at the hearings that we just held in Kelowna on March the 9th to the 11th. And so I'd like to welcome Vincent Gircys and Christa Nicholson. Welcome. Thanks for joining me for this conversation tonight.
Thanks for having us here, Ted.
So we just held 3 days of hearings in Kelowna, March 9th, 10th, and 11th. And the theme of these hearings was a brand new topic for the National Citizens Inquiry. It was the question, are farmers safe in Canada? And then by extension, the question, is our food safe in Canada? And I have to say that these were compelling hearings. I wasn't sure what to expect. And I certainly learned a lot of things that were not known to me previously. And I think the public was very much served by these hearings. Before we get into Vincent's and Christa's experience of the hearings, I just thought we would take a minute for those that may be new to the National Citizens Inquiry and talk a little bit about the role of the inquiry, and then the role of commissioners and how they serve this process. And so the National Citizens Inquiry was conceived in 2022. We had a vision to conduct hearings across the country on the and the initial focus was looking at the government's response to the COVID experience. And so the National Citizens Inquiry conducted 27 days of hearings in 9 cities across the country before 4 independent commissioners. All of the testimony is given under oath. It's a quasi-judicial process. And the NCI produced the largest body of evidence given under oath in the world on the government's response to COVID. Following that set of hearings, we ventured into a new area of conversation, and really very much an extension of the COVID conversation by focusing specifically on children. We then asked the question, are children safe in Canada? And we conducted another, I think we had 15 days of hearings on that question. And then in 2026, we began this conversation around farming in Canada. Some of that was a result of the experience of the culling of almost 400 ostriches in Edgewood, BC, which is just a couple of hours away from Kelowna, BC. But also, we put out a survey in early 2026 asking Canadians what they would like the National Citizens Inquiry to explore next. And this issue of farming, and particularly the issue of culling of livestock, was very much high on people's list of priorities because of the experience at the ostrich farm in Edgewood, BC. And so I just want to underscore that this is a citizen-led, citizen-funded initiative, citizen-organized. It's completely independent of government influence, of corporate influence. And the focus of the NCI is to hear the truth, often truth that has not made its way into the public realm. And so it's one of the things that I'm grateful for, is that I hear information that often is either not available or it's being withheld from the public. I thought we would spend a little bit of time tonight talking about the role of commissioners. And Vincent, you served as a commissioner now. I think this is your 3rd set of hearings, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
And so this is you've become quite familiar with the process of the National Citizens Inquiry and have served admirably as a commissioner. And maybe I could get you to just speak a little bit about the role of the commissioners and how important that role is to the integrity and the credibility of the National Citizens Inquiry.
Certainly. So one thing I've noticed, Ted, that you mentioned the role of the NCI, and I have to say, we've learned so much over the last few years that there are things that a big component of what we learned is that there are things that we are not aware of that are problems. So you can't fix something until you realize it's a problem. So as a commissioner, I believe that one of the roles that I have taken on as commissioner, having a background in law enforcement, having spent 32 years in law enforcement, I was always focused on getting to the bottom of what the truth was in any particular investigation. So as a commissioner, I feel compelled that when testimony is presented, that we want to extract the truth from the witness that's presenting, whether they're a professional witness or not. And ultimately, we want to be able to unpack as much of the information that they're trying to provide as possible so that we have a really good understanding just what the scope and breadth is of this issue that they're bringing to the table. And I have to say, being a commissioner is sometimes quite disturbing because we don't really know what it is that we're going to be hearing at any particular hearing that usually comprises about 25 witnesses. We have 6 or 7 witnesses a day, sometimes 8. And when we start to hear the evidence that's being unpacked, it's heavy. It's very heavy evidence, and it's probably not something that everybody can hold. It's quite taxing on you emotionally, psychologically. But we want to extract as much information as possible because in the end, commissioners are going to work together to prepare a final report on that subject matter. And we want it to be as accurate and truthful as possible.
Christa, this was your first time serving as commissioner. You've served as counsel in a previous NCI hearing. How was it different for you to shift from counsel to being a commissioner at a hearing?
Thank you, Ted. Yes, it was very interesting, and there was a different perspective. It was a different perspective that I had when I was a commissioner. Now the role is to listen, perhaps in a even more unbiased way. When you're counsel, you're trying to draw out the information for the commissioners to be sure that the witness gets out their testimony so that everyone can hear it and the commissioners can then decide. So it is a different role. As Vincent stated, it is challenging as a commissioner to hear and the extent of the evidence that you hear, and that you're riveted to trying to take in every detail, not to miss anything, and to really be totally present so that the truth can eventually come out through our comprehension of what was said. So those are the differences as I would see it.
Yeah, it really is a fact-finding mission, and it's a platform that allows both expert and lay testimony to present information. And part of the responsibility of both counsel and the commissioners is to draw out that information, to examine it, to ask questions. And one of the things, Vincent, that I really appreciated, particularly in this last set of hearings, there was a couple of times that you asked a very clear question, and the question was simply, is that statement that you've just made, is that based upon fact or is that an opinion? And that's an important distinction, isn't it, Vincent?
Absolutely it is, because factual information and opinion evidence are two completely different things. They may sound similar to the average layperson, but quite frankly, if you're expressing an opinion, but you don't have the knowledge or the data to support that, that makes a big difference. And that makes a difference on how much that is going to get weighed upon at the end when the report finally gets completed. Now, if a witness is saying something that is an opinion and it's substantiated by a number of other witnesses testifying on similar matters, that again is all weighed and added, and it puts more credence to the weight of this testimony. But there are different types of testimony. Sometimes we'll have a witness unpack something, and in the presentation, they'll make reference to documentation, and I may want to ask the question, do you have those documents to submit as evidence as well? And when they do, or say I can make them available to the commission, that goes a long way because it's supporting information. It's all supportive. So that's helpful.
Now, the task of the commissioners doesn't stop at the end of 3 days of hearings. It's in some ways, it's only just begun. Maybe, Christa, you could talk a little bit about the responsibility of commissioners and what they do with the testimony.
Yes, Ted, this is my first round as the commissioner, so I'm looking forward to the process. And my understanding, of course, is that if there are further hearings to come on the question of whether farmers are safe in Canada and further days of testimony, then of course we will hear those. But eventually we will get together and as commissioners and do some comparison of notes with respect to the takeaways that each of us has for each witness, and essentially prepare a report that will be a joint effort assigned on to by all of the commissioners that properly reflects what it is that we've heard, together with completing and compiling some recommendations for what the next steps might be. So I think that is the process. That's my understanding of the process, and I think it's a very good one.
Vince, anything to add there to what Christa just shared?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. I have to say that sometimes things that are not said are relevant as evidence in here as well. There are a number of witnesses that have backed out of the inquiry at the last minute. And one of the comments that was made by one of the witnesses was that it's not convenient now to tell the truth. And I think the biggest problem we have, the biggest challenge we have in Canada right now is making it a priority to tell the truth. I think we were all raised to believe that telling the truth was the right thing to do. I think we are experiencing so many lies and so much deception across this nation on so many different issues that telling the truth is paramount right now. So some witnesses do back out and they're frightened to tell the truth. And that in itself is telling to the importance of some of these issues. And it's quite frightening to see that these things are happening.
Well, and you've underscored something really important when you said that it's not just the testimony that's given, but it's the testimony that's not given, particularly when the testimony has been withdrawn or the opportunity has been withdrawn because of coercion or threats. And these hearings were a little bit exceptional in that regard, in that we had a number of witnesses that were had agreed to testify, were actually eager to testify, and then received messages from various agents that suggested to them it wasn't in their best interest to make a public statement about the matters that the hearing was conducting. And so that by itself says a lot about the situation here in Canada.
That's correct. And in addition, it's my understanding that the NCI also subpoenas or summonses a number of people within that area or jurisdiction to gladly come and unpack what they would like to say, whether it's politicians or other prominent people within that community who choose not to come, who choose not to speak. And that in itself says volumes as well.
So what you're referring to there, Vincent, is that with every set of hearings, we have invited our elected representatives, both at the federal level and at the provincial level. With these particular set of hearings, we invited the president of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Minister of Agriculture, and others to testify. And with few exceptions, those invitations are either ignored or declined, which speaks to the challenge we face in both gathering sufficient information and in, I might say, in accountability. Christa, you mentioned one of the responsibilities of the commissioners when they're writing the report is to provide recommendations. And I think that's a key piece that I want to just underscore for our audience. It's not just about recounting or summarizing the evidence that's presented. Part of the goal of the NCI is to listen, to learn, and then to recommend. And for example, the commissioner's final report after the set of hearings on COVID produced over 400 recommendations that the commissioners felt were important to address the concerns or the challenges or the violations of fundamental rights and freedoms that we experienced during that period of time. And so I think it's important that our audience understands that this is meant to be both an opportunity for truth. It's a fact-finding opportunity, but it's also meant to be a very thoughtful process to address the concerns in a constructive way. And it's not about laying blame, but it is about identifying solutions to some of the challenges we face as a community and as a country.
Yeah, I thoroughly concur with that. And in terms of the importance of the recommendations, I think those go hand in hand with the taking of the testimony in a way. The taking of the testimony is the way that these stories are preserved in the historical record. So in and of themselves, that process alone is highly valuable for our society, to know what people on the ground have experienced, to give a voice, to allow this process allows them to give voice to some of the challenges that they are facing. And then for the commissioners to hear that and try to synthesize it into real life takeaway recommendations that that the government and other agencies might want to have regard to. Think about businesses. They're often surveying their clients and their customers. How do we do here? Tell us if we could do better. So in a sense, I think we're contributing to that accountability piece and giving information for those who may wish to receive it in terms of always better, continuous improvements that can be made. And so when messages are heard that, take some of the things that we heard recently about farmers and the struggles they have with the government involvement, the day-to-day involvement, the regulatory hurdles and obstacles that they are required to meet. One might think about recommendations that might, involve reducing the red tape, making it easier for people to do their jobs. Those kinds of things come to mind for me when I think about some of what we recently heard in Kelowna.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about the testimony that was received in Kelowna. I think we had 25 or 26 witnesses. It was a broad spectrum of testimony. I have to say that I was surprised. Much of what was shared in that testimony was unfamiliar to me. I probably wasn't one of the strongest advocates for doing a hearing on on farmers, but after hearing 3 days of hearings, I came to a much deeper appreciation about how we need to understand the challenges that our farmers in Canada are facing, and then the implications that has on our food supply. Vincent, maybe you could talk a little bit about, just first of all, just kind of a high level takeaway from those 3 days of hearings in Kelowna. What stood out the most for you?
Well, a lot stood out for me, and I have to say it's pretty heavy. So when it all comes in heavy, there wasn't any testimony that was not important. All the testimony was important. So I'm not a farmer. I don't fully understand agriculture, and you don't need to understand agriculture to know there's something wrong in this country or what those wrong issues are. But this testimony on farming dealt with the land, the dirt, the soil, the products that go into the soil and how it affects us, the animals, the grains, and the food that's grown, and mostly the people that suffer the consequences of government overreach and bureaucracy. And it seems like everything is on autopilot. And when things go wrong, and they certainly are going wrong, farmers take the brunt of these problems in trying to grow safe food. But they're under tremendous pressure that we hear in terms of financial elements that they have to deal with, spray regulations, products that they have to spray, issues with the animals. And then probably the worst of it is the government overreach and the authority that the government has strictly based on suspicion. Mm-hmm. And I'll leave it there for that particular subject, but we'll probably break it down in the next 45 minutes.
Yeah. Christa, what was some of your high-level takeaways from those 3 days of testimony in Kelowna?
Well, I really like how Vincent talked about it almost like a cycle. And the one thing that I noticed as well is we did hear one witness from speak on water, the state of the water, including contaminated water. So in addition to what Vincent mentioned, there was that as well. So I concur that for me, a lot of gaps got filled in. For instance, I had heard about supply chain management. I always understood, oh, there's a situation with milk. And I hear there seems to be dumping of the milk going on here. And I don't, because of these quotas and how challenging and maybe beneficial to some that is, how challenging that is to others. And then, to hear people in that industry, and then including academics who deal directly with these topics, university professor and the like, I found that really interesting and very high level discussion on that problem. So that was one thing that I took a lot from. Another I learned a lot about was the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, of course, and its powers, and how it what authority it has, the kind of power that it has, and the challenges that people can have perhaps dealing with some of the agencies. Of course, there's probably many examples in society where people have good experiences and don't have challenges, and those folks, didn't come forward. But the ones that did come forward definitely raised some challenges they had on that level. And then one of the testimonies, relatedly, was from an individual who had moved to Canada, to Saskatchewan from the United Kingdom. And she was explaining how they had suffered there back around 2000, a big challenge with their livestock regarding the hoof and mouth disease. And she went through and explained how, it was extremely traumatic what happened to their livestock. And then she left there and came to Canada with 2 young children to start up a farming business and to try again. And thinking that she would come to the freer West, let's say, from the UK, which she thought was perhaps, more constrained. And when she came here and she understood the authority of the Canadian government in comparison to the UK government, she became quite concerned and convinced that the treatment in the UK of farmers, as traumatic as it had been, turned out to be very, better than the way the farmers were treated in Canada. And she gave some examples there which really stuck with me. She said that one of the things that often can happen for Canadians if there's a kind of a challenge, a health challenge for animals, that the farmers can be asked to terminate the lives of their own livestock. So she said that could be very traumatic. People grow up with this livestock for some time. So she noted that in the UK, the government did that, didn't require them to do it. Then she noted in the UK that there were fair market value provisions, and like, as long as you could prove the fair market value of your animals, that you would be compensated for that. And she seemed to suggest that in Canada, there were less compensation available, or that there was perhaps more pushback to a fair market value assessment. And then finally, there were other examples, but another one that really did stick with me is when the payout occurs for the livestock that is terminated. In the UK, she said something to the effect that it was, there was a small window for that payout. It occurred quite quickly, within a couple, 2-3 months, something like. And she compared that to the Canadian situation, which she said was, months, potentially in months of time. So I found that really telling from a person who left a country wanting to come to what she perceived to be a better arrangement for farmers, and then realizing that she ultimately did not think that it was better at all. That was one case that really did stick with me. And there were many others, but I'm happy to turn it over back to Vincent or back to you, Ted. I can speak more too if you want.
That was very powerful testimony, and she was very articulate in outlining the differences between the system in the UK and the system in Canada. And you've identified about farmers whose livestock had been culled, that they would get fair market value for their livestock, but also a very timely payout for the loss of their herd. And my memory was it was 10 days, but it might have been a couple of months. Whereas we were to hear from a farmer in Canada that had a couple of $1 million worth of livestock that was culled more than a year ago and still had not received compensation for the loss of his herd. And I don't know how a farmer can survive those kinds of situations with that level of uncertainty, whether they have the finances to continue their career, their passion, their livelihood.
Agreed.
I think the most disturbing testimony for me was the testimony that was given by Lee Turner, who was a lawyer for a period of time of the ostrich farmers. And he explained in quite detail how the Canadian Food Inspection Agency can cull livestock, whether it's cattle or deer or poultry or ostriches, merely on suspicion. They actually don't need evidence of an infectious disease that is a threat to Canadian society. And what we learned in the ostrich situation is those farmers were actually threatened that they could not test their own animals. And if they did, it was a significant fine, I think $250,000 and jail time. And so it was very surprising to see how the lack of what I would say is transparent evidence to support the actions of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in a number of situations.
Is that a question to me, Ted?
It's not a question as much as my statement, but was there a particular testimony, Vincent, that stood out for you?
So on that point of the ostrich farm, let me just say that I want to unpack this component. What I've noticed here from all this testimony is that we have two types of farming in Canada. We have corporate farming, which is very large scale, and we have small scale farming. And in Canada, there are a lot of people who are eager and anxious to want to farm. There are some people who are very passionate about farming, but there are impediments into getting into the game. And even if you're in the game, you go out and buy a 3-acre or 10-acre smaller farm. We've heard from so many people about the struggles and what makes it so hard in this bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy is actually not allowing the system to thrive at all. That's the common thread I get, is that the system, the bureaucracy seems to be working against the system, and a lot of people are getting out of farming. Now, to the point of the ostrich farm, classify that as a small scale farm. There was a lot of information prior to the NCI hearing on that issue. There were a lot of stories. Independent news was covering that. But from my perspective, I really didn't know as an outsider looking in what was really going on, because I don't think we were really getting all the information. So this was a great opportunity to be able to unpack the information, because people from the CFIA were invited to testify. They chose not to. And we had some witnesses testify, not only the owner from the farm itself, but Lee Turner, as you said, had testified on a lot of the legal issues. And he no doubt provided a considerable amount of evidence and information that the public would not normally have been aware of. Mm-hmm. And what that did is it talked about the bureaucracy. It talked about what really went on, the entire story from a legal perspective of what happened. And there was no doubt from the evidence provided that the cull order issued on those ostriches was issued prior to the preliminary tests results coming back. So that is extremely troubling when a cull order is already issued and the test results hadn't even come back. And you can see that the CFIA it can act strictly on suspicion rather than having accurate test results back. And the results of much evidence that it was unpacked following that was quite concerning. So I'm very thankful that we had the opportunity to listen to all the evidence associated to that and to get a real good understanding of just how much authority the bureaucracy has within this country and how dangerous it actually is.
If I could just supplement one of Vincent's points there, Ted. One thing that we think about is, and which I learned about, was of course the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Well, in connection with the ostriches, we learned that this was not about food. So they were not engaged in they were not being raised for the purposes of food.
Right.
So it struck me as so very strange and odd for a food and agency to be dealing with what seemed rather to me purely agricultural or farm livestock or I mean these are ostriches, but relating to animals unconnected to food supply. So that was a takeaway I had as well, where you have a food agency exercising jurisdiction over a non-food herd.
That's right. Ted seems to have disappeared from a weak signal, should be back in just a few moments. To that point, Christa, Yes, the evidence that also came out on those ostriches were that they were being bred as breeder ostriches. Their eggs would have been gone and been used as further breeder ostriches, these were not for meat consumption, at least the ones on the farm. They weren't being eaten as food, correct? Ted, you were back with us.
Yes, they didn't like what I had to say, so they got rid of me. So still trying to figure out who they is. What other testimony or witness really struck you in terms of the quality of their testimony, or just being moved by their experience?
I'm going to immediately go to the dairy cartel. We hear that quite often. We know it's a very powerful organization and one that is taken off the negotiating table during even international trade talks. So it's something that it should be fascinating to all Canadians to learn that in dairy production in Canada, as a highlight here, the amount of wastage of milk per year. Now, I've asked this question to a number of my colleagues and friends and family about see if they know the answer to this question. In how much dairy is wasted in Canada every year? It's actually disposed of. It's just thrown out. And nobody even came close to the number. Not even close. I think they were at 1% of the actual amount. And the amount is 1.5 billion liters per year that is spoiled. 1.5 billion liters a year. Now that's 1 billion liters apparently from the farms that have to pour it out because they would be in excess of their quotas. And then there's another 500 million liters per year that is wasted, which is the difference between what the trucks remove from the farm and what's actually used in production. It is not only immoral and a sin of epic proportion, but it should be a criminal offense to pour this useful product into the ground because it's exceeded a certain number. The methodology that could be incorporated in using this for people that are starving on this planet is just ridiculous. Canada is a very wealthy, rich nation in terms of food production. And it's completely asinine to believe that the bureaucracy of this country couldn't think of a more efficient, effective system to incorporate in our food production to prevent the throwing out of an edible product to that extent. 1.5 billion liters per year.
Yeah, that was pretty shocking, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
To think that there is a food that is being literally poured down the drain when we have families that are struggling to feed their families, and people suffering from starvation globally. I'm with you. Is you got to think that there's a solution there somewhere along the way.
And I wouldn't suggest that. And again, this is my personal opinion, not a commissioner's opinion. But I wouldn't suggest the government try to find a solution. But through private enterprise and a little bit of government funding, I can see a lot of that product being repurposed to food banks to feed needy Canadians in these times and struggles that we're going through. Another big subject that we talked about that was very, very important is the effects of glyphosate in food production. And that was quite disturbing to hear the details associated to that information.
Christa?
Yeah, I'm happy to just expand on that glyphosate story, because that really was on my mind as well to raise. And what we learned was that a few things. One, that Roundup, of course, is the generic name for the product that glyphosate exists as part of. And we learned that the formulation, the composition of Roundup in Canada is different than the composition of Roundup in the United States. and that the concentration of glyphosate in Roundup in Canada was significantly higher than that in the United States. I also learned that glyphosate was patented by a pharmaceutical company because it is the highest strain of antibiotic, so that it has it is allegedly has effects on the gut flora and the gut bacteria in animals and in humans. So we learned a little bit about the mechanism of action of glyphosate. And then what also seemed to be critical is that it wasn't strictly the amount of glyphosate in the product, but it was glyphosate when combined with the other adjuvants and other components that was creating a higher toxicity level. So I found that very much of interest and concern. And then kind of to the other end, we talked about dairy and maybe call it like big farming. To the other end of the spectrum was a compelling story by that lawyer who moved from California. Had been a lawyer, said, you know what, we're gonna have a different lifestyle than a busy lawyer lifestyle. We're gonna move to Kelowna and we're gonna have an orchard and we're gonna sell stuff on our little farm. And how she explained that, that it wasn't really feasible to do that. They wanted to run, I think she said, to the effect of a little cafe, and then when on their land, but then they ran into regulations that precluded them from selling, like having, if you grew cherries and you wanted to sell cherry pie, well, you couldn't, because the flower wasn't from the land. And you couldn't sell the coffee with the cherry pie either, because the coffee hadn't been come from the land. So there were these regulations around this small farming business that were causing her now to actually leave altogether. And then there was another kind of small farmer who she was into organic greenhouse growing, and she said that her family her parents had raised 8 kids running a cucumber operation in a greenhouse. And she said, she couldn't even run it just like for herself in the end, even as much as she wanted to, that it was just so cost prohibitive, and she was having trouble competing even at these farmers markets with other products that she said that some folks were holding themselves out as having grown themselves, but hadn't grown at all themselves, had obtained them, got the product from Costco even. And so she said that it was just so challenging in the environment to do a grow your own food kind of business. So that was the other end of the spectrum for me, the really tiny, small, little person trying to trying to grow food. And then I guess the final thing was this business about the cattle and how what the requirements are for even moving them, like how they're must be so tracked. And even a young child who wants to take their pony, or maybe it was a cow, I think it might have related only to cattle, so I'm not positive, but wanted to take it to a showing, a cattle show, had to report in potentially that same day that it had moved off the farm and had gone to a show. So there seems to be almost an approach to these cattle that's almost geo-tracking them. And anyway, I found that to be very interesting, and maybe I think the argument, of course, was that there's a need to be sure, on account of the food safety, that these animals are tracked and traced, but it sure seemed to put a lot of burden onto those ranchers.
Well, it seems so ironic that there's so much justification for these regulations based upon safety, and at the same time we're spraying a component onto our food that we know is toxic and poisonous and causes cancer, but somehow that's permitted. You begin to question the actions of our regulatory agencies and what their priorities really are, or what the agenda really is. I have to say, I'm really looking forward to the report that the two of you and your two other fellow commissioners are going to pull together in the future. Because of the intense interest in this topic, we are going to hold at least another set of hearings, likely in June, I think is the dates that we're beginning to explore. Because one of the surprises that happened following these hearings is the number of farmers that approached us to say, I didn't know anything about the National Citizens Inquiry, but I heard about these and I want to testify at them. And so I think we're actually going to be inundated with farmers who want to tell their story, because their story is not being told. And Canadians, and I'm guilty of that as well, is naive to the challenges that our farmers face in this country. Maybe in the last 10 minutes or so, we could just talk a little bit about the experience of the community that attends these hearings. And so, for example, in Kelowna, one of the things that we did for the first time is that we provided meals for our volunteers, for our witnesses, and for those that were attending the hearings. There was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And both of you have been to other hearings, and I think you probably noticed a difference by spending time together with in community, sharing a meal.
It was wonderful to be able to do that, to sit down and have these up close and personal conversations with witnesses following their testimony. One thing I'd like to add is that as much as this is very heavy in terms of unpacking this testimony that is quite troubling and disconcerting, but there are also witnesses that testify about some extreme hardships that they went through in dealing with the food industry bureaucracy, and even to the point where they were arrested and put in jail for, in one case, it was Jim Ness, one of our first witnesses, that did that for the sake of exporting some grain into the US. The Americans were more than happy to take the grain, but the Canadian government was very angry and upset about it, even though we had this tremendous surplus of grain. But he made a point, and he did it in a way that eventually had the government change the regulations. So we can see changes coming when farmers work together, strategize, and bring awareness to the citizens of this nation about the problems that they're facing. So there is tremendous hope for bringing about change as well. And as you say, the manner in which the hearings are taking place is really, there is a real informal background component of having these open discussions. And we actually, not for the sake of the report, but just for the sake of our own knowledge, there's a lot of clarification that comes from having these conversations with our witnesses as well, and meeting people within the communities and spreading the word of the National Citizens Inquiry as well. I don't think we could get very far if we didn't have the National Citizens Inquiry in not only documenting these important issues, bringing attention to these issues, completing reports on these issues, But we're not going to fix any of these problems if we don't at least first identify that we have problems. And that's what the NCI is. It's a huge component of what it's doing.
Yeah. Christa, what was it like for you to be in that NCI community for 3 days in Kelowna?
Well, I really found it uplifting, actually, even though in the midst of all of the challenges that we heard about, I really was taken by the community. The volunteers were a big part of it. And as you say, just being in a community setting, as so much effort had gone to making really even local food available to the participants. I really was impressed by that, and it felt like a welcoming environment for everyone. I felt that anyone who came would have felt welcome and really would have benefited by hearing the testimony as well directly. It was very meaningful to hear it personally as well. So I would encourage folks to actually come out to the event itself and spend a day there listening to the witnesses and having lunch with everyone. I thought it would be, I enjoyed it, and I thought others did as well. And I would encourage anyone to come to the next set of hearings.
Yeah, what I witnessed happen is that there were a number of strangers that were there on day one, but by day three, it was a very tight, harmonious group, lots of conversation, lots of hugs. And to me, the community got stronger as a result of that experience. One is that they learned more. They witness courageous people standing up and speaking their truth, even if they were afraid to do so. And people, what I saw is that people find their voice, they find their role in helping to create a better society. And I believe that some of the benefit of the NCI is not just what happens during the testimony, but it's that coming together of a community. It's citizens taking ownership and responsibility for the society that we live in, and it's actually a very powerful experience that has exceeded even my expectations for the NCI. How about some concluding thoughts, Vincent? Any concluding thoughts?
It's kind of hard to say. From my perspective, I found that the set of hearings that just took place on Our Farmers Safe in Canada, every bit as important and impactful and quite draining to hear the problems associated with that compared to the hearings of the year before. I just get the feeling there just seems to be no shortage of things that we need to be concerned about in this country. But to the point of farming, yes, I certainly encourage everybody to, in some way, shape, or form, participate with this venue, whether it's through donations, whether it's through posting, and being that loud voice on social media to talk about the importance of the NCI, whether it's to volunteer or whether it's to attend these hearings and or to spread the word to people in subjects associated to what the hearing is about. Please spread the word, and we all contribute as best we can. These are very important issues. And again, if you're not focusing on the NCI, if you're not following the testimony of the NCI, you wouldn't realize how important this is. Mm-hmm. Farming is something that affects each and every one of us in this country. And we need our farmers. And not only do we need our farmers, we need the entire industry to thrive. And we need to do whatever we can to support them and to make farming and the farming community thrive, both from the commercial aspect and the small producers aspect. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why it shouldn't completely thrive.
Christa?
Yeah, I really felt the vulnerability of farmers after the 3 days of testimony. So to the extent that we can support our farmers through the NCI hearings in a way, in the very least, giving them a voice so that they know that they've been heard, and then trying to advance recommendations, and so they have a sense of, well, we're not alone in this process. We have others who support us, and it also links other farmers throughout all of Canada. It creates bridges between different farming communities, even, and different farmers. And just, I would think, knowing for some of these folks who have experienced this trauma, knowing that there are others who have gone through it as well, and being able to use NCI as a bridge to contact them, I think also serves as a supportive role for these vulnerable folks. And so we want to make them, or I think, try and ameliorate some of these challenges somehow that they're facing. And so I think NCI can try to help in many ways, including the ones we've spoken about already.
Yeah. Well, my takeaway from the 3 days is that our farmers are not safe in this country. And if our farmers are not safe, then we're not safe, because we need farmers to have food. And this puts our food supply at serious risk. And those are important things for us to focus our attention on. We have to get our priorities right. And these hearings, I think, were incredibly important to the future of this country. And I look forward to continuing this line of inquiry in June. Vincent and Christa, thank you both. Thank you for your service to the NCI. Thanks for being my guest tonight and helping to share with our audience both the role of commissioners and the important testimony that we received in Kelowna.
We're looking forward to the next set of hearings.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining us tonight, and look forward to seeing you again on NCI Live.